Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad to see all of your faces here in the room and to know that there are so many out there watching us through live stream on our various platforms. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm the Director of Adult Education here at Central, and I am just so honored to be presenting this evening's program and speaker to you. Ernest Brod, who will introduce himself in much greater detail to you over the course of the next hour. He was almost 3 when he and his mother arrived at Ellis Island. He grew up in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, attended Columbia College, Columbia Law School, and then worked for the Federal Trade Commission, spending 15 years as their general counsel, and then spending 15 years as the general counsel of an international telecommunications firm. 40 years ago, he took a big leap into the burgeoning field of corporate investigations. He hasn't looked back, leading the global investigations practice at Deloitte and other major consulting firms. Then, because not one to be content with what he'd already achieved, at age 83, he launched his own firm, Brod Global Intelligence. He is a luminary, praised for his extensive experience in applying cutting-edge forensic techniques to due diligence, fraud, and corruption investigations for law firms and for companies around the world. A year ago, at Yom HaShoah in 5783, in 2023, Ernie decided to speak publicly for the first time about his life as a Holocaust survivor. We are again honored to welcome Ernie to our community. He spoke for only about 10 minutes on Sunday at our Yom HaShoah service. Tonight, we get to hear much more of his story. Ernie, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Berman. I'm just so pleased to be here tonight, and I'm so pleased to have gotten to know you in these last few months as we prepared for the event of Sunday night and this wonderful event tonight. And thank you all for taking time from your lives to come out. I very much appreciate it. So we don't get to choose where we're going to be born, but any Jewish child would not have chosen to be born in Vienna, Austria in April of 1938. 3 weeks earlier, the Nazis had marched triumphantly into Austria, welcomed with open arms, although the Austrian government will argue against that today. The Nazis had a well-planned approach to how they dealt with new countries that they were taking over. They went for the organs of communications and propaganda, so the newspapers and radio and so on. My family, unfortunately, was caught up right in the middle of that. The good news for my family was that my grandfather and his brothers owned a very successful, lucrative, and prominent movie business, motion picture business. They produced movies, they distributed them. Often people watched their movies in the company's own movie theaters. There was a claim to fame in that this company, Lux Films, produced the first German language talking movies. So the Nazis immediately reached out and grabbed that company. And in the process, they detained all the men. My grandfather, his brothers, and my father, who worked at the company. The older generation somehow knew how to worm their way out. Perhaps there was bribery, or perhaps they made deals involving pieces of the company. But they came back. My father did not. My mother was frantic for several months trying to understand what was happening to him. She had just given birth to me. She had my older brother, 3.5 years old at the time. In July, she was informed that my father was dead. The official document said suicide. We know that the Nazis very often used that dodge, although it's possible that that was actually true. There are letters from the jail, my father writing to my mother in jail, which miraculously have survived, and I've had the opportunity to look at them. And you can see an increasing despondency in those letters. So it is not impossible that he did take his own life in whatever horrible circumstances he found himself. So there was my mother with her baby and her, I don't know what you call a 3.5-year-old infant toddler, something like that. And life became more and more perilous for Jews in Vienna as the Nazis turned the screws tighter and tighter and making life less and less livable for Jews. My mother heard of something called the Kindertransport. This was a device, a technique that had been put together by various wealthy Jewish families around the world who donated money to enable trains, Kindertransport, children's trains, to save Jews, Jewish children. The trains ran from Vienna and Berlin, and they went to England. And there were volunteers who had signed up in England to take these children, look over them, watch over them. The people who signed up for this assumed that they would be watching these children for weeks, months. In fact, as we know, time just went on and on. My mother's hope, perhaps rationalization, was that at some point she, with me, would be able to join my brother in England. That, of course, was something of a pipe dream. And when war broke out, it became absolutely impossible. As more and more difficult things were taking place for the Jews in Vienna, at one point the Nazis started rounding up groupings of Jews, putting them on transports to concentration camps. My mother and I were put on one of those transports. And the story that's been told to me is that at some point on that trip, the 1.5-year-old me, colicky baby, colicky child, coughed and sneezed and screamed and yelled and made a horrible commotion. And one of the guards came over to my mother and said, "Get him the hell out of here before he drives us all crazy. Take him to a doctor." We don't know if that guard was being unusually friendly or whatever mood he was in, but for us it was, of course, a miracle. Instead of going to a doctor, my mother went directly to the U.S. consulate. There was miracle number 2. That miracle was a visa sitting there in our names, giving us the permission to enter the United States under the very tight quota that President Roosevelt had established. She took me and worked her way across Europe. How? I wish I knew. This is one of the many things that I never chose to ask, and now, of course, have no chance, opportunity to ask. There's about a 1-year period of unaccounted time when she was apparently making her way across Europe to Portugal. As you may know, Portugal was a neutral country in the war. And in Lisbon, Portugal, there was a ship called the Serpa Pinto. It made frequent voyages back and forth carrying refugees to New York. Research that we've since done indicates that that may well have been the very last sailing of the Serpa Pinto, because German U-boats were making traffic across the Atlantic pathway more and more impossible. We landed at Ellis Island. It was March 1941, 3 weeks before my third birthday. And my first memory is of my third birthday. I'm going to stop the story for a moment and turn to the photographs. That adorable child is me. As far as I know, the only picture of me in Vienna. Not a bad one. There's my mother as a young woman. And my father as a young man. And there's their wedding picture. Here they are after they were married, and you can see some indications of the good life that the family was leading. Those pearls, I'm assuming, were pretty expensive. The family moved in the highest financial and social circles at that time. Here's an invitation to an opening of a film from the family film company, Lux Films. Weirdly, the movie starred Billy Wilder. I don't know if it starred him or he was the director of it. He later, of course, came to the U.S. and became famous as the director of some movie, Some Like It Hot, which is considered one of the greatest movies ever. And there he is in the middle of my family. Here's a playbill of another one of the movies. Lux Film, Koppelman. Ryder Koppelman was my mother's maiden name, so my grandfather's name. Here's the application for the visa. The affidavit that had to be signed by an American citizen who would give a financial guarantee for the people that were coming into the country to swear that they would not be a financial burden on the country. Down here, you can't see it. It's wonderful how the world has changed. He is warned that the following classes of individuals are excluded from the U.S. 1, idiots. 2, imbeciles. 3, feeble-minded. 4, epileptics. 5, insane persons, etc., etc. This is the other side of it. Looking for the signature. The person who signed this, and this is a very important point. Who was this American citizen who went to the trouble of doing this? Well, I have to bother you with some family history. My father was the youngest of 11 children. many of the older children were long out of the house when he was born. And there were siblings whom he had never met. One of the oldest, a sister of his, had immigrated to America, landed in Brooklyn, met a man, got married, set up home in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, raised 3 children, and then died. Her widower, my mother's brother-in-law, right, the husband of a sister of her husband, brother-in-law, Hyman Rothenberg, was living alone in Brighton Beach. The children were out of the house. He was approached by another member of the family. My mother's sister and her family had managed to get out a year or 2 earlier and had also set up their homes in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, which was kind of a gathering place for Jews from Vienna at that time. She approached her sister's brother-in-law about doing all the paperwork to get her sister and child to the U.S. So he was the signator, the guarantor of this. It was not all eleemosynary. He was kind of hoping that if things worked out, this woman could become his wife and there'd be another woman in the house to take care of him. So this was the circumstances into which I arrived in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. My first birthday party was with my aunt and uncle and cousins and my uncle all together. And in the event, several months went by, and my mother and this uncle of mine got married. So my uncle became my stepfather, okay? And life kind of went on. We lived in a small bungalow in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. I can actually show you. And I'm going in the wrong direction, of course. Let me stop here for a moment. This is the passport which got my mother from Vienna to Lisbon, Portugal. You can see how it's marked there for Portugal. So this is the new family. There's my mother, my stepfather, and me. I don't know, 10, 9, I don't know, not sure. If I was 10, my mother was 40. My stepfather was 62. He is in this picture and was a tall, strapping man, always looked younger than his years. My mother, at least to me, looks much older than her years, kind of haggard. So with my mother looking older, my stepfather looking younger, they did not look mismatched as a couple. But boy, were they mismatched in other ways. My stepfather had never gone to high school. He was unread, uncultured. He was a streetsy type. My mother, of course, had come out of this highly cultured family, having been married to my father, who had a PhD.
Just have you hold it a little further from your mouth. There you go. Perfect.
Sorry, who had a PhD and had been trained as a rabbi, but never practiced as a rabbi. My mother's life was as different as it can be. The two husbands were polar opposites. Her life was polar opposite. My mother had learned English in Vienna and came here speaking English well, although heavily accented. My stepfather spoke a kind of a Yiddish-English mix. He knew no German. They communicated in a weird combination of Yiddish, German, and English. And life went on. The fact that our family was a little different from other families was not lost on kids in the neighborhood. One day I was minding my own business when the neighborhood bully cornered me, and I thought my life was over. And he put his face right next to mine and said, "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to ask you a question." I said, "Okay, what's the question?" He said, "Why do you call your father uncle?" So I went home and asked my mother, "Why do I call my father uncle?" And they kind of huddled up, and she came back and said, "Call him Dad." And I did. The question of the names, the family name, was also confusing to people. In those years, families were traditional and normal families. Leave it to Beaver families. So I would come home with a report card, and my mother would sign it with her name. First name was Peppy. Her married name was Rothenberg. She'd sign it Peppy Rothenberg. Well, in the school, somehow there was all this confusion about who's Peppy Rothenberg when the kid is Ernest Brod, and so on and so forth. So we talked about that, and she started to sign my report cards Peppy Rothenberg Brod. So we dealt with that. For me, the most important thing was to feel like an American, to be like all the other kids. And I quickly intuited that the way to do that was to become a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And I did. Boy, did I. I went crazy over baseball and Brooklyn Dodgers, listened to every game. It wasn't easy listening to every game, because about the fourth or fifth inning of almost every game, my stepfather would come over and say, "Baseball again. From this you're going to make a living?" Over and over again. If I tried to avoid him and go into the other room, he would follow me to make sure I didn't turn any lights on, because whenever I turned a light on, he would remind me, "Edison is rich enough." These lines stay with you. So I became a Brooklyn Dodgers fan, probably as rabid a Brooklyn Dodgers fan as there was, and was moved to tears and worse when the Dodgers left. That was the end of my childhood, end of innocence, and all of that. Okay, as a child, I'm living with this family. I don't remember anything from before that. This is the family I remember. Other kids had imaginary friends. I had a brother 3,000 miles away across an ocean. Another way, I was a little different from other kids in the neighborhood. So I always knew I had a brother. My mother would correspond with his foster parents and with him. And I would write him letters from my earliest age. "Dear Manfred, how are you? I am fine. And we're better, I hope, as years went on. And we would exchange comic books. I would send him Superman and Archie Andrews and whatnot, and I'd get these weird British comic strips with funny animals that talked, and it was on like tissue paper. And sociologically, you can look at that exchange of comic books and understand the difference between the war years in the US and the war years in England. Really kind of interesting. So why was my brother still in England and we were here in Brighton Beach, in Brooklyn? My stepfather signed on for bringing a potential wife and her child. He could have lived without the child. He'd already had his children. He had no interest in acquiring another child. And the conversations and disputes about that between him and my mother, and the huddled whispers between my mother and her sister about Manfred and what's going to be, it was the Shakespearean dilemma of my childhood. It just went through everything. So we got to 1947. I'm 9 years old. My mother has somehow scraped together enough money to buy a ticket on the Queen Mary to go to England and be at my brother's bar mitzvah. I get shuttled off to my aunt and uncle and cousins, and there's all this whispering and this kind of this thought in the air that she might come back with my brother. I had serious ambivalence about that. Sure, it'd be cool to suddenly acquire an older brother. On the other hand, I had a really good thing going as an only child, and my mother's life just centered around me. So she went to his bar mitzvah, and there's my mother on the right, my 13-year-old brother, and his foster parents. So my mother talks to them and to him about his coming with her back to the US. He's a sullen, angry 13-year-old trying to understand who this strange woman is, who he doesn't remember at all, who wants to take him away from his family. And he resisted. And his foster parents argued very strongly to hold on to him. They themselves were immigrants to England from Holland, childless. They were thrilled to have him and to raise him. And they contended with my mother that they were raising him in a lifestyle far beyond what he would have in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. And in the event, my mother returned without him. So time goes on, and we get to 1960. My mother's diagnosed with terminal cancer. My brother decides that he's going to come over to see her. And he does. And one day in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, we opened the door to my brother. Hello, how are you? Nice to see you. What the heck do you say to a brother that you've never seen before? So there's a weird little unimportant but story connected with all that. in my memory, and I've told this story hundreds and hundreds of times, is that as a proper Englishman, he arrived to this meeting with a gift. And he had a package with him, and he gave me the package. And I opened the package, and I'm looking at a bunch of things, round things in circles, metallic. And I said, I'm really embarrassed, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is. And he said, I wish I could do the British. You've never seen a napkin ring? And I'm thinking, we were happy to have paper napkins in our house, let alone a napkin ring. What the heck would I do with a napkin ring? So that's the story I've told. The last time I was together with Manfred, I had occasion to tell that story in his presence. And he said, what are you talking about? I never brought you napkin rings. Why would I do that? So what can I tell you? One of the mysteries of history that'll never be resolved. Anyway, Manfred goes back, my mother dies, and later that year, Manfred is going to get married. Manfred has been raised Jewishly, nicely, gone to Oxford, met a woman in Oxford, married, was about to get married. I actually met his fiancée before I met him. Another craziness. She had the opportunity to come to America to study for a graduate year, and she was on her way to Minnesota, I think, University of Minnesota, and she stopped in Brooklyn and visited us. And I'm pumping her about, tell me about my brother, and so on. Also crazy. Anyway, I can't do this right. I go to their wedding. It's my first trip across the ocean in a 3-engine plane, a DC-3, 24 hours to Iceland, to Reykjavik. I can still feel the noise and the rumble of that trip all these years later. But I go to their wedding. They go off to their honeymoon. I go visit another aunt of mine. My mother had another sister who, incredibly, had returned to Vienna with her husband after the war and was living there. They were among the 12 Jews who were living in Vienna after the war. But I visited them, and they took me around and said, there lives a Jew, there lives a Jew, there lives a Jew, that sort of thing. And I went from Vienna to Rome to the 1960 Olympics. The Olympics were a little different in those days. You could walk up to a gate and buy a ticket and go in, and I did. And I had an incredible time. So I come home. This was now my final year of law school, after that summer abroad. I had gone to Columbia College and Columbia Law School, and there's a story attached to that. When I was a kid, wandering around the neighborhood with my mother, neighbors would invariably comment about this kid with a big mouth. This kid should be a lawyer, everybody would say. And my mother would say, yes, he's going to be a lawyer, but first he's going to Columbia. And I'm thinking, what's a Columbia? I don't know what she's talking about. But this goes through my childhood and whatnot, and it becomes like a fact. I'm going to go to Columbia and then become a lawyer. So I go to Columbia. At Columbia, I get involved with the newspaper, the Columbia Spectator. Sports, sports, sports. I had been the sports editor, actually deputy sports editor of the high school newspaper. One of my dear friends who's probably on this Zoom call beat me out on a technicality. But then we both went to Columbia, and he didn't even apply because he knew he had no shot. So I become sports editor of the Columbia Spectator and director of sports of the Columbia radio station, and I'm broadcasting the games and covering the games and sports, 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 sports. So now I'm a senior, and I'm supposed to go to law school. And I don't want to go to law school. I really want to go to journalism school. But my path has been set for me. It's Columbia College and law school. So I make a deal with my mother. I'll go to law school if I can get into one of the 3 top law schools. Otherwise, I'm off to journalism school. So the morning of the law school aptitude exam, I direct myself as sports editor to cover a sports event, which meant that I would just about make it, or maybe be a little late for the exam. Trying to throw it. But I got there more or less on time. I did regrettably well. And I had to stick to my part of the deal, and I went to Columbia Law School. I couldn't stand Columbia Law School. Really didn't want to be there. Anyway, I get out. As the rabbi said in the wonderful introduction, I go to work one of the few places that a Jewish graduate of law school in those days can go, the government. You had a choice of about 2 of the 30 or 40 Wall Street law firms that would accept Jews. You had a couple of industries. Most of the industries, banking and energy and insurance and whatnot, were closed to Jews. We had the government. So I went to the Federal Trade Commission, spent some time there, and then found my way to an international telecommunications company. Telecommunications, close to journalism, international, sounds good, and whatnot. And I wrangled the position in that firm where I'm the delegate to international conferences. So I get to travel overseas a lot. Manfred is working for Exxon, or as it was then known, Esso. He's in England. Esso's got their main offices in New Jersey and Texas. He gets lots of opportunities to cross the ocean. We start to see each other a couple of times a year. And we joke that we probably see each other more than brothers who live across town from each other. And we became closer and closer. One of the early trips I have to tell you about, it was perhaps the 3rd or 4th time that I was meeting him. He had not yet been to my home that I established with my first wife, Carol. And he had been transferred from England to Brussels to spend a couple of years there. And they had rented a house, and he told me all the things that they did and so on. So I had the opportunity to stop off and see them. So I come out of the taxi and walk up to the front door, and he's standing in front, and we do our usual thing. He with his British half handshake, and me with my American, and we meet in the middle, and so on, the usual awkwardness. So we're still not all that comfortable with each other yet, so we walk in, he's gonna carry my bag, I'll carry the bag, we go back and forth. And here's the foyer for their house. And out of the corner of my eye, I see something very familiar. And I look up, and it felt like a brain cramp, like my brain traveled, my airplane traveled brain wasn't functioning or something. I'm looking at Picasso's print of Don Quixote. And I'm saying, how is this possible? I left it on my wall in Brooklyn. What's it doing here? And I suddenly realized that these two brothers who had been completely raised apart had exactly the same Picasso print at exactly the place in their apartments. My brother had never seen the one that I had. And I'm trying to process all this, and he says, well, come into the living room. And we walk into the living room, and there are the same brown Danish modern chairs that my wife and I have in our room. It was not to be believed. Anyway, they made trips to the US with the family. We made trips there. Manfred and Jess have 2 children. A daughter who went to Oxford, a son who was very rebellious and went to Cambridge, and their granddaughter who's at Oxford, and their grandson who's at Cambridge. And Manfred lived most of his time recently in Oxford and then moved to Cambridge. So it's a completely Oxbridge family and world. One of the trips that stick out in my mind when he brought his family with him, and we decided to do a combined family vacation someplace upstate, maybe the Adirondacks or something like that. And they've got all kinds of games and sports and whatnot. And we find ourselves in a place where there's a ping pong table. So I'm looking at this, I'm looking at him, and I say, would you like to play a game of ping pong? And he says, all right. And I pick up a racket, and he picks up a racket, and we start to hit the ball. And I'm saying to myself, this is the first time in my life that I'm competing, have any kind of competition with my brother. And that's my excuse for messing up my game. I couldn't really concentrate after that. When Manfred was 65, he retired from Exxon and decided to pursue a lifelong interest of his in history. Just as I did law most of my life, really interested in journalism, he did chemical engineering, really interested in history. But when he retired, he decided to go back to Oxford, and he did. And if we do this 100 times, I'll figure. And he got a PhD in history, wrote a book, wrote some articles, and became a prominent historian in his 70s and 80s. He's about to be 90, and if things go well, Ruthie and I will be there for his 90th birthday. Okay, there are so many stories and whatnot, but I think it works for me to stop there and leave some time for questions.
So if you raise your hand, we'll bring around a mic, and you can ask.
Thank you very much for sharing your story with us. I was just wondering, when you were talking about quotas in the law schools and other professions when you were graduating, were there also Jewish quotas in the schools at the time when you were applying? And I ask that because my grandfather went to Columbia, and there was a Jewish quota, and actually that did affect his choice of profession, because he was there undergrad. He applied, he wanted to be an ophthalmologist, and they told him, no, there's a quota, but we'll let you be an optometrist, which he was very happy with, and I'm not denigrating that at all. He was very successful and enjoyed it. But I was just kind of curious, since you brought that up, it just kind of made me think about that time, what was happening.
Sure. Thank you for that. So this takes us to today and Columbia. It's all tied together. I was the benefit of the quota system at Columbia. Columbia got such miserable publicity about the quota system in those years, the years when I was thinking of going to college, that the year before mine, they decided to open the gate wide. The result was 50% of my class was Jewish. It was crazy. I mean, just a bunch of Jewish guys, there was guys then, just a bunch of Jewish guys from New York was half the class. And the other half were these weird kids who went to private schools, which never understood any of them or wanted to go anywhere near them. So, yes, the quota system was a horrible blemish in the history of Columbia and all the Ivy League schools. I wrote a letter to the editor last week of the Columbia Spectator. You should know that not only was I a crazy active member of the Spectator when I was at college, I've been a trustee of the Columbia Spectator Corporation for probably 40 years. I was just honored 2 months ago for my lifetime of service to the Columbia Spectator. Notwithstanding that, I wrote a letter to the Spectator after one of their editorials that was so obviously pro-protest, saying, I entered Columbia 13 years after arriving at Ellis Island as a refugee from the Holocaust. Columbia was my sanctuary. It helped me through 7 years, and I went on and on about the wonderful things Columbia has done and the things that, in response that I've done for Columbia. And I said, I don't remember the degradations that my family was subject to in the universities or others in Vienna. But I do see what Jewish students now are being subjected to, and I won't have it. And I'm going to suspend, I said, I'm going to suspend my support for the university until they take the steps to ensure that Jewish students are safe on the campus. So I've brought your question around to the president.
Our next question comes from the Zoom room. Brendan Fu says thank you for this talk and is curious, what made you, a year ago, decide to start telling your story publicly? It sounds like you know Brendan.
Brendan is my work colleague. Delightful young man. We have so much fun together. And this is a setup question. In my business world, I network with people, lawyers mostly, and reach out to them often to want to go to lunch with them. A couple of years ago, I was having lunch with a nice man named Lawrence, and we're just talking, and I don't know how on earth it came up, but somehow it came up that he is the child of Holocaust survivors. I said, oh. I said, so am I. I'm not the child of, I am of, I am. And he started asking me questions. And before I knew it, he had really pulled the entire story out of me. I had never told the entire story, never wanted to. didn't want to really accept it as a meaningful part of my life. But I told the story. And life went on. A year or so later, I'm attending a conference that his law firm is putting on, and he's there. He sees me in the audience. At the end of the conference, comes up to me and says, "I've been thinking about your story. It's stayed with me." And I'm thinking, gee, that's unusual. Most people, when you just tell them something, their life moves on. So I was taken with that. He says, "My son's high school often invites people in to speak about the Holocaust on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. We have someone for this year, but for next year, would you be willing to do that?" I said, "Sure." And I'm walking home, and that thought, that image of standing in front of an audience and telling the story is playing around in my mind. And I start to feel stronger, more and more strongly, that, I think I want to do this. I said, okay, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. How do I start? Columbia. I call Columbia Hillel, ask if they'd be interested. The Hillel director says, "Well, come over, let's talk, and I'll hear your story, and we'll see." He hears my story, and he says, "Would you be willing to be our guest speaker next week at Yom HaShoah?" And they put out nice advertising saying, hear Ernie Brod's story of survival and success. And I kind of like that. I like the way they put that. And I found myself sitting like this, except on a stage and in a more comfortable chair, in front of 200 kids at Hillel in Columbia. And I'm telling my story, and I'm just telling it. And I'm looking at the body language and so on. I'm seeing, boy, these kids are really, they're really hearing this. They really hear it. And I felt comfortable and good about that. I finish. I'm bombarded with kids coming up to tell me about their families and ask me things and so on. I said, okay, this works. I called the Chabad at Columbia. And a couple of weeks later, Ruthie and I are at a delightful Shabbat dinner at the Chabad house, and 160 kids gather around the table. And I tell an abridged version, more like the one I told Sunday night here, 10, 12 minutes rather than 45 minutes like this one is. And that went well also. I then reached out. I thought, it's nice that I'm telling this to Jewish people, but it would be nicer if non-Jews heard the story. So I reached out to Fordham and Iona and whatnot, and I made a contact at Fordham, and I found myself speaking to, of all things, a Holocaust class at Fordham, bolstered by the, you should excuse the expression, Jewish organization at Fordham. There was about 3 people, but they also joined, and I told the story there. And then I thought, again, if I'm going to do this, keep doing it right. I went online and I made a list of all the organizations, Jewish Holocaust organizations that had speakers bureaus, and I contacted all of them. And I'm on the Speakers Bureau of the Museum of the Jewish Heritage downtown. I'm on the Speakers Bureau of the Holocaust and Human Rights Organization in White Plains, New York. And between the two of them and Rabbi Berman, I've made 6 talks surrounding this weekend of Yom HaShoah. And it's all thanks to Lawrence. Thank you, Lawrence, out there in cyberspace, if you're there.
Hey, how are you? Quick question over here. as a non-practicing Quaker, but finding out that you're 25% Jewish, this has been really amazing. My question is, well, first off, thank you for explaining this to people like myself and also to the younger generation that's sitting here today. Nothing personal. It's important that we learn this because at this point, when he gets older, there's not going to be many people telling these stories. My question for you is, when you were growing up in the United States, particularly in Brooklyn, obviously there were some fathers who were in the war, and I guess growing up with those kids, they might have experienced the same traumas, but from a different perspective. When they moved, or when the fathers returned, and or mothers as well, that were participating in the war, did you ever get the opportunity to talk to them about their time over in Europe or in Japan and so forth?
The answer is really no. You're talking 1945. I was 7 years old. The way in which I was most aware of the war was that in our little bungalow in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, we rented one of the rooms. So there were my mother, my father, and me, and this family of three, all using one bathroom, of course. And their teenage son went off to war, and he was killed. And being aware of that as a 5 or 6 years old, 6-year-old was brutal, absolutely brutal. My youngest step brother / cousin, first cousin, was in the Signal Corps. He was 21 when I came into the family. His older brother's married and gone. He was not yet married. So when he came home from the war and leave in between, he came home to Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. He got married very quickly rather than continue to live with all of us there. But he would give me little trinkets from the Signal Corps and so on. That's as close as I came, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for sharing and for being with us this evening. What ended up happening to the rest of your family in Vienna? You said your father had 11 or 10 older brothers, and some of them got out of that prison, but what ended up happening to the family?
Thank you. My grandfather made his way to Palestine. And here we go again, with his son, who is my half-uncle. It sounds like a comedy skit, I'm sorry. But in addition to having cousins who were step and whatnot, I had a half-brother who died only fairly, a half-uncle who died only fairly recently, my mother's half-brother. So they got to Palestine and had a decent life there. The two brothers, one went to Shanghai, which was not unusual in those days. The other came to the U.S. There wasn't as much contact among all of them in my family as you might have thought. Families being families, there were disputes. There had been this movie company. It was very valuable. What happened to it? Who's entitled to restitutions payments? I owned 40%. No, you didn't. You owned 20%. I remember as a kid being upset by hearing the talk about all of that. But there was that one uncle. There were two sisters of my father who went to Palestine and stayed in touch or got in touch. And I got to know them a little before they died. I was in Israel once or twice. They were in New York at least once, so I got to know them. And they told me a little about my father. It was wonderful to hear little things, little characteristics or whatnot about my father from them. There was another brother who went to Canada, came to Brooklyn once on a visit and stayed with a cousin. And my mother and I went to visit. I remember thinking as a kid, this is a big day. I'm meeting a brother of my father's. At that point, I think the first sibling of my father's. So we come into this apartment in, I don't know, one of the heavily Jewish neighborhoods of Brooklyn, which have now all changed a little bit. But open the door and walk in, and this uncle takes one look at me and says, "He doesn't look anything like my brother," and kind of turned on his heel. And that's what I remember about that day. I was not happy. I was not a happy kid. Okay?
Ernie, we're going to take one last question. We've already run out of time.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for speaking tonight. I thought at some point, did you mention that I might have misheard this, but was it that your father had studied to be a rabbi?
Yes.
And was ordained as a rabbi, but he worked in the family business? Was that an unusual move for him?
I can't tell you. Did he? Was he following the money? I don't know. But what I'll tell you, another part of the story, which is a little off center from exactly what you're asking. The family name is Brod. Those of you who've studied or read about Kafka have heard of Max Brod, who was Kafka's executor, and is famous for not having followed Kafka's order to destroy all of his works when he died. And the community has argued over this for 100 years as to whether he did right or did wrong. So the question has always been, was my father related to Max Brod? Well, every time I met a new member of the family, I would ask this question. And it went right down the middle. Half said, "Of course," and half said, "Don't be ridiculous." And I've tried to do a little research into it. I've contacted some people who've written books about Max Brod and so on, and I'm not seeing anything. My guess is it's not true.
So there's so much more to hear. There's so much more to say, but our program has come to an end. If Ernie's feeling generous, maybe he'll stick around and answer a couple more personal questions. But really, we're so grateful to all of you for showing up, for hearing Ernie's story, so that, as we said at their service on Sunday, once you've heard his story, it also becomes your story, and it becomes our job as the bearers of these stories to keep telling them and sharing them with our future generations. So Ernie, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure.